So we will now start the FTA Thought Leadership series here today on the topic of how much sustainability is in the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. Before we dive into the content, there are just some logistics I just want to go over. So just by default, so everyone is aware, everyone is muted. We will have the 10-minute Q&A at the end of the webinar. So on that note, I just wanted to make you aware that we do have the chat box, and you can view that on the right-hand side here, where you can insert any of the questions that come up throughout the webinar today, and we will address them at the end. We will also be hosting 2 poll questions. Again, these can be viewed here on the right-hand side where you can see the poll questions. We will do one at the beginning of the webinar and at the end of the webinar, and then we'll share the results at the end. So the audio check we've already done, but if at any time you're having a hard time hearing me, please do send it through the chat. I also have my colleague Jana Dietzlich here today, who will be assisting with some of the technical things, so if anyone's having any difficulties there, she can assist those questions. So, handling the welcome and introduction for the webinar today is myself, Natasha Hassing. I am a membership officer here at FTA, as well as Pierre Gröning, my colleague. He is the head of international trade policy here at FTA. So just to cover the agenda for the webinar. We will spend 5 minutes doing the welcome and introduction by myself and Pierre, and then following here shortly after we'll do the poll question. We will then spend 10 minutes covering the context and business case, which will be led by Pierre Gröning, our internal expert on the subject matter. And then we will have 15 minutes for each of our guest speakers diving into the expert insight. We will have Frau Sommer from the European Commission. She will provide an overview of the sustainability chapter in the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. And then to provide a business insight on the subject matter, we have Monique Ensink is here with us today from the company Excellent Product, and she will share personal insights and best practices of the sustainability situation on the ground in Vietnam. We will then have the 10 minutes of Q&A, so please remember to submit your questions throughout the webinar in the chat box. Then followed with a poll question, and then 5 minutes for just the concluding remarks at the end. So on that note, I will lead it off to my colleague, Pierre. Pierre, please take it from here.
Thank you, Natasha, for the nice introduction. I'm particularly glad that we dedicate the first webinar of this FTA series to a topic that is really at the heart of current discussions on commercial policy at the EU, which is the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, and more specifically its sustainability aspect. Today I will briefly outline the current context of EU-Vietnam trade relations in order to set a backdrop for the discussion that will follow on the sustainability chapter on precisely this agreement. And secondly, I will also put forward the business case for the need of today's webinar and its topic, because one or the other might wonder why we dedicate, as I mentioned earlier, this webinar to Vietnam. And I will start with that question actually, to see why is the retail sector, why is the European economy so interested in this free trade agreement, EU-Vietnam and Vietnam as an economy. To demonstrate the significance of EU-Vietnam economic relations, I will quickly present a couple of figures. The trading goods between the two sides was worth close to 40 billion euros in 2015, which is a quite dramatic increase of more than 10 billion euros from 2014. And if you compare the figure to 2005, you will see that even the gap has been widened even far further. In 2005, the EU-Vietnam trade was about 7.5 billion euros. So I think that clearly shows that Vietnam is of increasing importance for the EU, and of course EU increasing importance for Vietnam. There's no doubt about it. If we look more specifically about Vietnam as a sourcing market, and that's one of the main grounds of activity of the members of my association, we will see that Vietnam is increasingly delivering goods, consumer goods to European market. Just to give you 2 or 3 concrete examples, on footwear, electrical goods and furniture, Vietnam is number 2 of a sourcing market for the EU. On coffee, number 3. Household products, seafood, number 4. So that clearly shows that consumption of Vietnamese products has become quite an essential part of daily life of many European consumers, and I think the EU agreement with Vietnam will help further developing this clear business link. When we look at Vietnam as a future market, and that is relevant because we know that this free trade agreement will not come into force in the next 1.5 years, and there will be some transition periods that apply. So important to look at the development in the next 5 to 10 years. We will clearly see that Vietnam will gain as an importance, at least for FTA members, as a sourcing market. We have asked our members very recently, in the beginning of this year, what they think about Vietnam as a sourcing market of the future in comparison also to other markets. And the result, surprisingly not, showed that Vietnam is ranked number 3 of countries that will grow in their importance as production markets for the EU. Number 1 was, for your information, Eastern Europe, followed by Turkey, and then Vietnam is number 3. The second aspect that I should highlight here, why Vietnam is of that much relevance for the retail sector, is Vietnam is a booming consumption market. It's a country with close to 100 million consumers, a mid-class that is gaining size every year. And in that respect, very evidently, more and more retailers, brand companies from Europe are seeking to get a foot on that market to sell their products. In that respect, again, we think that the free trade agreement will be a helpful tool in developing our business activities. Maybe just a couple of words on my association, the FTA, Foreign Trade Association, which is representing approximately 1,800 European international retailers, importers and brand companies with a combined turnover of more than 800 billion euros, which is a couple of times the Vietnamese GDP, just to give you a comparison. My organization is truly global. We represent companies from 36 countries and have sourcing activities in more than 75 countries. The FTA is not only interested in the economic aspects of trade, which is covered, let's say, on this slide by this box on the left side, the international trade policy dimension, but also very much for the simple reason that we want to promote sustainability along the supply chain. And in that respect, the FTA and its members are, I think we can truly say, historic frontrunners in promoting sustainability in the supply chain. Very simply because of today's interdependence between trade and sustainability. I think there's no discussion about this, and I think today's webinar is a proof of that interconnection. The products which our members are dealing with, so mainly, let's say, consumer products that you would find in a supermarket, are often produced with quite intensive labor and also with an important impact on environment. In that respect, many FTA members thought that the FTA could take a lead in developing programs to improve the sustainable and environmental footprint in the supply chain. And for that reason, we came up with 2 programs that are, I would say, quite leading in the international dimension. The more important one and the more historical, because it's more than 10 years old, is the Business Social Compliance Initiative, which supports companies committed to improving working conditions in factories and farms worldwide, in line with FTA's vision of sustainable supply chains. The BSCI integrates the latest international standards from, notably, the ILO, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations. And of course, with Vietnam, one of the main sourcing markets for our members, we carry out quite an important number of activities such as social audits, but also workshops and meetings with all kinds of stakeholders. The second sustainability initiative that the FTA is running is the Business Environmental Performance Initiative, BEPI, which aims at reducing the environmental impact along the supply chain. And I'm proud to say that Vietnam is a country where we have launched the activities of the BPI with a pilot phase that took place in 2014. So we can clearly also see that Vietnam and the Vietnamese government is very interested in promoting sustainability in the supply chain. So one can really say that the association is based on two main pillars, which is the aspect of free trade and open trade on the one hand, but also the sustainable trade aspect. And later on, Monique, as a member of the FTA and the BCI, will give more insights and first-hand experience from a company perspective on these two programs, mainly on the BCI. Today we talk about EU-Vietnam, and I've already given some hints of the interest of our association in that negotiation process and now in the post-negotiation process. Vietnam is one of the key deliverers of products of mass consumption. We are interested in that agreement for two reasons. The first reason is simply the economic aspect. The FTA agreement will clearly help businesses to develop, and we anticipate quite some significant increase of bilateral exchange of goods and services because of that agreement. And the second aspect is that this agreement also contains a strong chapter on sustainability. I think it's fair to say it's the most ambitious chapter of sustainability that was ever included in a free trade agreement. But I assume that Frau Kessauer will say a couple of words more on that dimension in a few minutes. Today, negotiations have been concluded, but the agreement is not in force yet. So we are running now through the ratification process, which will take a couple of months, hopefully not too many of months. But okay, we do not expect the agreement to come into force ideally end of 2017 or early 2018. So we need approval not only from the European Parliament, but also from the EU member states, organized in the the Council of Ministers. And of course, that's a process that we as the FTA follow and monitor very closely. And in the meantime, we have realized, and that's the reason why we have organized this webinar, that there's a lot of discussion about what is the sustainability dimension of this agreement. What will this agreement change in terms of promotion of sustainability between the EU and Vietnam? I think it's a natural and very fair reflex by stakeholders, but also by politicians, to look at this link, also given the strong interrelation between trade and sustainable development. We have, as the FTA, we welcome this discussion, and we wish to contribute to this discourse from the very beginning and add to the discussion in a balanced and fair manner. I think Vietnam itself has experienced quite some radical economic development in the recent period, with a strong transition from a state-owned, state-run economy to economy that has at least some elements of openness, and I think that has triggered quite some economic growth, and we have seen that this economic growth has clearly tackled poverty, that many Vietnamese have been pulled out of poverty. Just to give you one figure in that respect is that the income of the bottom 40% of Vietnamese has grown by 9% since 1993. So making it one of the fastest rates of improvement in welfare in the world. So I think the openness of its economy has clearly been a reason for that, and Vietnamese intention to be part of international supply chains. There is no doubt the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement is expected to help the country to continue on its economic development path, but in order to ensure that economic growth continues to be followed by social and environmental improvements, a strong sustainability chapter is mandatory. Nevertheless, we should not be naive and maybe also unrealistic and believe that a trade agreement is a panacea for remaining challenges. Many factors contribute to the improvement of social and environmental standards, and the free trade agreement will not make a revolution in itself. That is very clear to us, but at the same time will nevertheless make an important contribution to facilitate dialogue and to contribute to a process of mutual understanding between EU and Vietnam on the very important aspects of sustainability. I think we should be clear that all actors along the supply chain, governments, local industries, NGOs, obviously, civil society, and Western businesses need to go hand in hand in order to ensure that there's a continued improvement of the level of sustainability in Vietnam, but I think that's a general rule that is also valid for other countries. The FTA has supported for the inclusion of such a chapter on sustainability through the negotiations because we firmly believe that open cooperation and dialogue are the best ways of tackling challenges in the implementation of the whole agreement and the sustainability chapter in particular. So to conclude my kind of bit of longer introduction remarks, FTA strongly supports the speedy implementation of the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. That's an important point, so that the two parties and economic operators will benefit as soon as possible from the market opening and business opportunities. And we also very much support the discussion about the sustainability aspect of the agreement. In that respect, I'm happy now to leave the floor to Frauke Sommer to present you the framework for ensuring sustainability practices in the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pierre. And here's just a quick reminder for everyone that any questions that are coming up, please do send them through the chat box, and we will be addressing them at the end. So now we will be moving on to the EU context, which will be presented by Frauke Sommer. Since 2011, Frauke Sommer has been in charge of the EU's bilateral trade relations with Vietnam in the Directorate General for Trade of the European Commission. Over the last 3 years, she has coordinated the negotiations for a free trade agreement between the EU and Vietnam, which were conducted last December. So on that note, I will now hand it over to Frauke Sommer.
Thank you very much, Natasha, for your very kind introduction. Thank you very much for having invited me to this webinar. I'm very happy to be here. Good afternoon to everyone who's listening out there. I'm actually very pleased to be able to inform you about the results of these negotiations when it comes to trade and sustainable development. And I'm very happy to hear what Pierre Gröning has said. It seems that we are absolutely on the same line when it comes to trade and sustainable development. We share the same ambitions in this respect. And as you know, it is indeed the EU's policy to embed sustainability aspects in all its dimensions in our trade policies. In my presentation today, I will cover several issues pertaining to social, environmental, and human rights issues in the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. I hasten to add that when we started these negotiations with Vietnam, the Vietnamese were actually very hesitant to negotiate a trade and sustainability chapter with the EU. Also because they had already gained some experience in negotiations with the US in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And as you may know, the US is applying a completely different approach, which is sanctions-based, while our approach to sustainable development is based on engagement and on dialogue. So in the beginning, these negotiations were rather difficult, so we adopted an educational approach. We took a lot of time explaining to our Vietnamese counterparts why it is beneficial also for them to engage in sustainable development and to have an ambitious chapter covering all the aspects of it. And surprisingly, they then engaged, and this chapter was indeed concluded 1 year before the entire FTA negotiations were concluded. So that came quite as a surprise, but as a very positive surprise. I will now give you a brief outline of what our sustainability chapter actually covers, the main features of it. It is chapter 15 of our FTA. And I was very happy to listen to Pierre, who said, who qualified this as a very ambitious chapter. And I also think that indeed we have concluded a very robust chapter on TST, going in many aspects beyond other FTAs that we have concluded with other partners. But also on our side, obviously, it's a learning experience. For the first time, we negotiated a TSD chapter with Korea, which, when you look at it now, seems to be rather meager, but we have made a lot of progress. And again, Vietnam is certainly among the most ambitious chapters that we have ever concluded. So it covers the respect for all 4 core ILO labor standards, namely the labor standards pertaining to the effective abolition of child labor, the elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor, freedom of association and collective bargaining, and the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. It also encourages both sides to ratify the other fundamental ILO conventions and their effective implementation. And when I say both sides, indeed, on the EU side, we have not ratified all of the ILO conventions. It also encourages the respect for the multilateral environmental agreements. And we also have very strong provisions to prevent a race to the bottom on labor and environmental standards in order to attract trade and investment. So this should be absolutely avoided. There are also provisions on corporate social responsibility. It also encourages fair and ethical trading schemes. And one of the main pillars of this chapter is the involvement of civil society. That is a very important pillar in our policy to involve civil society, both on the Vietnamese side and also on the EU side. We, on the EU side, we have already done that before we launched the negotiations, but in the context of this bilateral agreement, this involvement will start once the FTA enters into force. Let us now move to the first pillar of the chapter, which pertains to labor matters. Both parties have taken commitments to the effective implementation of the ILO core labor standards and the ratified ILO conventions. We have also taken commitment towards ratification of non-ratified fundamental ILO conventions. Just to give you an idea, Vietnam has not yet ratified the following ILO conventions. That is the freedom of association and protection of the right to organize, the right to organize and collective bargaining, and the abolition of forced labor conventions. So there are strong commitments on the Vietnamese side to move towards the ratification of these ILO conventions that have not been ratified by Vietnam yet. And both parties will also consider to ratify the non-fundamental ILO convention. On environmental matters, both parties have undertaken commitments to the effective implementation of the ratified multilateral environmental agreements. For the first time, we have included in an FTA, in a TSD chapter, a dedicated article on climate change, where both parties take commitments to reach the ultimate objectives of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And another new article for the first time is provisions on the conservation and sustainable management of biodiversity. For instance, wildlife trafficking was an area that was highlighted to us throughout the negotiations. So for the first time, we actually managed to get a provision on the fight against wildlife trafficking in one of our FTAs. There are also provisions on forestry, including on illegal logging. You might be aware that Vietnam is also negotiating a voluntary partnership agreement with the EU for the fight against illegal logging. One of the last negotiating rounds has taken place only a few weeks ago, and I've heard from my colleagues that these negotiations are going very well, and we hope to be able to conclude this agreement sometime in the autumn. We are also covering under environmental matters fisheries, including regional fisheries management organizations, the fight against illegal and unregulated fishing, also the management of aquaculture. Then we move to the horizontal issues in this chapter. As I mentioned before, our Article 10 of the TSD chapter obliges both parties not to derogate from or fail to effectively enforce domestic labor and environmental laws just to attract trade and investment. So this is in line with all our other TSD chapters, is fully in line with our overall policy. We are also promoting corporate social responsibility in Article 9 of the chapter. And we are also encouraging environmentally and climate-friendly products, as well as sustainability assurance schemes such as fair and ethical trade. We are also promoting the use of the precautionary principle, which means that when preparing or implementing measures aimed at protecting the environment or labor conditions that may affect trade or investment, each party shall take reasonable account of relevant, available scientific, technical, and innovation-related information. We have also committed to review the impact of our FTA on the sustainability dimension, which means that after 4 or 5 years after the entry into force of this agreement, we will look into the impact our agreement has had on economic, social, environmental, and also human rights issues. I now move to the institutional matters under the TSD chapter in Article 15. As I mentioned before, while the US and also the EU adopt an approach of paying a lot of attention to sustainability aspects in our trade policies, our approach is slightly different or largely different. The US has a very descriptive approach, while the EU is favoring an approach of dialogue and engagement with a third party. So, for instance, we have established under the TSD chapter a government-to-government body that will regularly meet and discuss issues pertaining to trade and sustainable development under the FTA. There's also a mechanism to involve civil society to monitor the implementation of the FTA and its TSD aspects. Civil society, of course, in Vietnam is a very vague concept, may I say, but what we are looking for is stakeholders of independent economic, social, and environmental groups. Obviously, this will be a process. Civil society as such might not exist in Vietnam today, but it is a process, and we hope for progress to be made in this area as well. So there will be a domestic advisory groups on both sides in the EU and Vietnam, and they will meet in a joint forum annually to discuss matters pertaining to this chapter. Another aspect which is quite different from the US approach is that we have a mechanism to resolve disputes which might arise under the implementation of the TSD chapter. Again, the US has a sanctions-based approach, We have an approach where we enter into consultations with the government of the third party. If this does not lead to a resolution of the dispute, we can have recourse to an independent panel of experts. And we can also involve international organizations to help us resolve the dispute. You will find in the TSD chapter detailed disciplines for the different procedural steps. And at this stage, I would actually invite you to familiarize yourself with the text of the agreement. We have made the text of the agreement available to the public. You can find it on the Commission's website under DG Trade, where you find all the 17 chapters and the annexes and schedules, so that you can familiarize yourself with the agreement. We have now more or less 1.5 years to prepare for the implementation and entry into force of the agreement. Pierre mentioned that we hope that this agreement can enter into force end of 2017, beginning of 2018. Our engagement, our dialogue with the Vietnamese has not stopped here, has not stopped with the conclusion of the agreement. We are still in regular contacts. We are now mapping out the gaps between what we have agreed in the FTA, what provisions are in the FTA, and what is already available in the Vietnamese domestic legislation, what is not available, and in case we have to, the Vietnamese have to put in place new domestic legislation, we will help them doing so. We are putting in place a roadmap towards implementation to make sure that the Vietnamese are ready to implement this agreement correctly and efficiently from day one. Natasha, now you have to tell me whether I can still go to my, okay, I see that I can still go to the last two aspects of the agreement, which are, of course, very, very important aspects. You know that in our foreign policy, including in our external trade policy, we're also talking about values. And one of the most important values that we wish to promote in our relations with third countries is the respect for human rights. And indeed, human rights are also embedded in our agreement. The preamble of the agreement reaffirms both parties' commitments to international human rights principles and instruments as spelled out in the UN Declaration for Human Rights. And there's also an institutional and legal link between our free trade agreement and the partnership and cooperation agreement to ensure that human rights underpin our relations in all its aspects. This link would also allow us to take appropriate measures in case we consider that there is a material breach of human rights aspects, a material and systemic breach of the human rights aspects. It could go as far as suspending the entire FTA or only parts of it. But of course, that would really be a last course. Because, as I said, our overall relations with Vietnam are governed by our partnership and cooperation agreement. It's very close to being ratified. Only one member state still needs to ratify it, and then we hope that this agreement can enter into force in autumn this year. And obviously, human rights aspects in all their entirety will be discussed in this forum of the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement. There will be a dedicated human rights subgroup, for instance. But again, human rights is also very important in our trade relations with Vietnam. This is why in May 2015 we have held a dedicated roundtable on trade and sustainability and human rights. On this occasion, there was a vivid discussion between stakeholders and the Commission, DG Trade, DEFCO, and the European External Action Service to look into ways on how we could address possible impacts stemming from the FTA on the human rights situation in Vietnam. We have developed a Commission staff working document, which I also invite you to study. It's also available on our website. It proposes recommendations and flanking measures on how to make sure that the FTA will not have a negative impact on human rights in Vietnam. Thank you very much for your attention.
We will now look into the business insight, which will be presented by Monique Ansing. Since 1999, Monique has been the owner of Excellent Products, which is a manufacturer of cargo securing products such as tie-downs, bungees, and tow ropes. The brand names are Jumbo and CrossSafe, and the company is based in the Netherlands and Vietnam. Excellent Products has been a member of the FTA since 2012, and Monique has been a member of the BSCI Steering Committee since 2014. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Monique.
Hear me? I think yes. Now, thank you for the nice introduction also, and thank you, Pierre and Frauke, for your explanation. Yeah, like said already, we have now 40 years experience in production, and we have our own factory in Vietnam. And the reason we choose for Vietnam is that we use also rubber for in our cords for the bicycle bungee. It's quite important to produce the rubber in the state where you have bought it, because otherwise it will be bad for the product at the end. And we also export direct from Vietnam to Europe, but also to Japan, Australia, Canada, and other Asian countries like Malaysia and Thailand. We started in Vietnam in 2010, looking for a partnership, and the factory was established in 2011. And then I didn't know how to set up the factory in the right way, so I joined BSCI FTA to learn how to set up the factory in a sustainable way. That was the main reason. I don't know how I can get to the next slide. I have not really looked through that. Maybe someone can do it for me, or can I do it myself? Okay, we have a mission. Our mission is to create 300 fair trade jobs in Vietnam, and we like to employ 70% women. Why women? We found out in the time that when we employ women, they really spend the money to their families, and the children can go to school, and we experienced that the men also use the money for their own lives, and they spend it on the happy hour. So that's the reason we like to employ more women. What I would like to say about the trade, sorry, I missed it out totally. What do I want to say about what I just heard about the human rights and the trade agreement between Vietnam and Europe? It has also to do with this. The main problem I oversee is the first thing is the human rights. My question is, how do we protect the human rights in Vietnam with being in this trade agreement? Because what we face is we sometimes lose our employees to other Vietnamese companies, and the reason is why, because we do not allow overtime. So one big question for me in the total trade agreement is, how do we handle with these companies, mainly Vietnamese companies, who have overtime, and we lose our employees to these companies? So that's my first question and remark to this trade agreement between Vietnam and Europe. Please to my next slide. This is just a sheet about our products, but you have heard about it anyhow. Next slide. Yeah, my motivation I just explained. On the right side you see the picture of our management team, and we work now with a Vietnamese management team. This is quite complicated because in a way the culture is different. And that's then my second remark on the trade agreement between Vietnam and Europe, is that we say, okay, we would like to encourage the corporate social responsibility. But how are we going to do that? That's my main question, because what I find out with our management team, local management team, is they did not learn anything about social responsibility at school or at university or in newspapers. So that is my main concern. And now we, with BSCI also on hand, and with the courses and the workshops, we try to convince them about the corporate social responsibility. But this is really a very hard job, and we tell them all the time what to do. But that sometimes doesn't feel very comfortable, because we are from Europe and they feel like that we teach them. So in a way, it should come from the Vietnamese government also. So the Vietnamese government should start a promotion campaign for corporate social responsibility, and I hope the European Union can help them with it. The next point I find quite difficult about this situation. Yeah, the core values is good. I can connect it to that. The next slide, please. We have the 11 principles of the Code of Conduct. We have implemented the Code of Conduct totally in our factory in Vietnam. Also, this poster hangs in the factory in Vietnamese language, everywhere around, and we also learn the people about it. And that brings me to the third point about this European trade agreement with Vietnam. It's about the freedom of bargaining and speech and the trade union. And we have called that into the, let's see, the right of freedom. That's the number one, right of freedom and association and collective bargaining. This is a very difficult point. Why? Also because it's not in the veins of the Vietnamese people. They don't know if it's possible to do so. We really tried our best, and we have meetings with the production people every month on a monthly basis, and we ask them to speak out their wishes. If they think something goes wrong, please inform us about it. But they are afraid. And you know why they are afraid? They are afraid because they are afraid to lose their jobs. Because there's not a proper, I don't know how you call it exactly in English, but I say dismissal. So to protect people if they lose their jobs. So that's also a task of the Vietnamese government, I think, because otherwise the people don't believe that this works. And now, after 4 years, finally, some people dare to speak out. Some of our employees dare to say what they don't like, and if they don't like something about the manager or they don't like something about the company. But it's really a very small part of the employees, and still it is quite difficult. So this is also a concern for me about the trade agreement. It's nice if it's on paper, but in practice I think it's very, very difficult. Next slide, please. Yeah, you on the right side you see here, this is a meeting with our employees, a part of our employees. This is of one of our departments, and we have with this group also, we have in groups, small meetings about, okay, what's going right, what's going wrong, and try to speak out your wishes. And this is what I was just talking about. Next slide, please. Yeah, also what I would like to emphasize is it's very important to keep also in mind the culture of the country you're working with. So this is a little altar, and I was asking, hey, why are these things here in the production area? It's not allowed concerning our code of conduct. You know, it's not allowed. It's maybe dangerous. It's sometimes also they burn candles, and but it's because of their faith. And they said, yeah, we had a lot of problems with broken needles of our sewing machines, and after we're putting this here, the altar, we don't have any broken needles anymore. So sometimes you have to think, okay, keep it there as it is. If it really helps, then we keep it like this, although it's not allowed to confirm our standards. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is a sheet, and this is what I found out, which makes our life quite difficult having a factory in Vietnam. we're talking about human rights, we're talking about labor standards, we're talking about fair and ethical trading. But this is what happens. A lot of factories do have subcontractors, and it's quite complicated, but it's also the way of living in Vietnam. I found out that one of our products was made by a subcontractor somewhere in the city, a rural area in a way, and this is the right picture, is the little in-house factory where a part of our production was made. In a way, I felt really uncomfortable to say it's not possible anymore due to our code of conduct, because it looked quite cozy, it looked quite, the people looked happy. They also could help their children because the children were running around and playing outside. And but this is really the way of life in Vietnam. And now with this trade agreement, all these ILO standards, we have to stop this. At the moment, there's something going on here. Okay. So this makes it's also a concern how to avoid things like this. And on the other hand, this is the culture in Vietnam. So it's a conflict of interest. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's one of my main points which I like to emphasize. You always have to travel to the factories you work with, and you have to look yourself what's going on. Then you really know what's happening. Also, I want to emphasize one other point which I just heard. It's about environmental agreements. I'm really like these environmental agreements in the trade agreement with Vietnam and Europe, but the European environmental rules are completely different than environmental rules or, for example, the USA. So that will be also a conflict of interest. So when a factory of Vietnam is working for US customers and for European customers, they really have difficulties, they will face difficulties with these environmental rules. So this is also something very important to realize how to control that, because it's really easy to put it on paper in an agreement, but to do it in practice, it's really a challenge for all of us. But anyhow, I have a lot of stories. I can share a lot of my experiences. It's still very nice having a factory in Vietnam, but it's really a big challenge, and I hope that trade agreement with Vietnam and Europe will make it a little bit more easy. But on the other hand, it's still a big challenge, I think. And my point, travel and look for yourself. That keeps is my statement, and it will be like that forever, because you always have to look at things also with your heart. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Monique, for sharing your personal experiences in Vietnam through the eyes of your company, so to speak. Okay, so Monique, you actually brought up some great questions to your presentation, so I will now hand it over to Fauk Summer, who will address some of those.
Yes, thank you, Monique, for your questions. Let me try to answer them. I mean, obviously, once the FTA is in place, that's not the end of the story. I think it would be the beginning of the story. The FTA can only set the legal framework. It sets out the commitments and the provisions that each party has to abide to. But we will continue to work together with the Vietnamese to implement these provisions and commitments correctly. And of course, Vietnam is a developing country, and we have also committed, we on the EU side, to continue to support Vietnam in its efforts. We have a chapter also on cooperation and capacity building in this agreement, precisely to help Vietnam to implement the commitments it has taken under this agreement. As I also mentioned, the TSD chapter has a strong angle of involving civil society, and through the involvement of civil society we will also convey messages, we will raise awareness, and all the concerns you mentioned, the fact that Vietnam has not ratified all the ILO conventions, again, this is a process which has only started now, and we will continue to encourage Vietnam to ratify and to effectively implement all these ILO conventions. You mentioned freedom of association and collective bargaining. They have taken the commitments. It is true, right now it's only written on paper, but we will not let the Vietnamese alone. We will accompany them to effectively implement all these commitments. You were also referring to the environmental issues. Well, actually, we are not imposing necessarily our EU standards on Vietnam or any other partner country. What we are actually doing is that we are promoting the use of international standards. I hope I have answered all your questions.
Okay, thank you for that, Frau Sommer. So we've actually received a question here directed to Pierre. The question is, could you please compare the Vietnam sustainability policy with the Cambodia one, which was a great success with regards to sustainability? So.
Yes, thank you very much. Maybe just a word more on the expectation that we can have with regard to the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement and its impact on sustainability and the development of certain, let's say, policies in Vietnam. I think it's a great starting point that we have this free trade agreement and that Vietnam committed to such ambitious objectives. And I think Frau Sommer rightly said it's a developing country. They have gone through a transition process in a relatively short time from a country that has been isolated from world trade to a country that is very open now to investment and in the exchange of goods and services. So I think also that we have to highlight. So things take time. But it's also crystal clear that Vietnam is committed to change, that the European Union will be very closely monitoring the situation in Vietnam. And again, this free trade agreement should be seen as a tool to facilitate a discussion on the development of a stronger sustainability policy on the Vietnamese side. Now turning to Cambodia. Cambodia is a country that has received preferences to the EU through the general system of preferences. So we are not talking about a free trade agreement in place between EU and Cambodia. And I think so let's say the approach to that country is slightly different in certain respect, but at the same time I think the promotion of values and standards that EU is committed to enable with Vietnam is also valid for Cambodia. And I think we have had clear words from not only European Commission but also European Parliament and Member States in terms of certain abuses of working conditions in Cambodia in the past, and I think successfully, because I think Cambodia has at least understood that to get access to the European market, you have to fulfill criteria that match at least minimum requirements. And again, I think we are here engaged in a very valuable dialogue where the European Commission, but also other institutions from the EU side are really promoting the respect of these standards. So I'm not sure we can call Cambodia a success case right now, but at least I think again we are on a positive track.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Okay, I do know that we're cutting it a little short on time, so we will be running a couple minutes over. I do want to take one more question, which is directed to Frau Sommer, and then after that, any questions that were not answered or any other further questions that come up, you can direct them to our info@fta-intl.org email address. So, Frau Sommer, how will effective implementation happen if Vietnam hasn't even ratified the ILO conventions, and which role does the Commission play?
Well, as I said, we have an institutional setup under the Trade and Sustainability chapter, where we will meet regularly to monitor also the effective implementation of all the commitments that Vietnam has taken. There will be involvement of civil society. There will be a domestic advisory group, both in the EU and Vietnam, and these domestic advisory groups play an important role in monitoring the effective implementation of the FTA. So many stakeholders will be involved in the monitoring of Vietnam implementing its commitments.
Okay, folks, thank you very much for that.